Hello and welcome to World History Encyclopedia. My name is Kelly, and today I am joined with Garry Shaw to talk all about his new book, Egyptian Mythology, A Traveller's Guide from Aswan to Alexandria. As an Egyptologist and author who has lived in Egypt, Garry couldn't be more qualified to take you on a journey up the Nile, and he does just that in his book, which is a combination of Egyptian mythology and travel guide. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today we're going to have a little chat about your new book, Egyptian Mythology from Traveller's Guide from Aswan to Alexandria. Do you want to tell us a bit about what the book is about?
Absolutely, yeah, and thanks for having me. It's really great to be here chatting about the book.
Pleasure.
So it is, um, it's a travel mythology, which is quite unusual. It starts with a journey beginning in the south of Egypt, which is kind of the traditional border in the region of Aswan, and then you travel northward to the Mediterranean Sea, stopping at various locations along the way, which have a religious importance or a lot of mythology behind them. And so that's the basic gist of it. And by doing this, it's quite a fun, different approach to Egyptian mythology than what you normally find in many of the books, because you'll find that many books on Egyptian mythology talk about it in a sort of thematic way, a chapter dedicated to this subject, then another subject, whereas this version, it means that we can approach it in a slightly different way. By looking at the locations, we can focus on the gods of those locations and the mythology that surrounds those particular gods, and the festivals or some of the rituals, and then we kind of progress to different cities and towns, looking at these different kind of beings and the beliefs surrounding them as we move along. And it's, I suppose, designed to be interesting not just to people who are traveling, but also people who are armchair travelers as well. So if you want to learn a bit more about Egypt and the locations and the gods, it's great whether you're on a cruise or in Egypt or if you're at home. But hopefully this different way of approaching the subject gives you a bit more, maybe makes it a bit more immediate, a bit more exciting, a bit more as if you are on the journey. And so, yeah, I'm hoping that people will really enjoy it because it's a bit different.
I found it very immersive because
Okay.
in each chapter, for our viewers, each chapter talks both about the site as an ancient site and what it would have looked like, but it also makes you feel as if you're standing there in the present day. So it says, it
Hmm.
tells you what it looks like now and what you would expect to see and what you would hear. And I found it incredibly immersive. And so, I don't know, it gave me goosebumps every now and then when you described a sound or you described what you were feeling. And I'm like, oh, I've got chills. It was a really wonderful new way to read about mythology. How did you go about compiling and making travel and mythology mesh? Was it a hard
Hmm.
thing?
I well, I think I got lucky really when writing it because Egyptian mythology lends itself very nicely to a travel themed mythology book in this way, simply because different locations around Egypt have different gods. And so you might go to one town or city and they had a god that was the specific focus of their attention of the temple in that town. Then you might travel a little bit further north and there's another town with a different god. And so it kind of creates the structure for you if you're doing a journey. So, for example, there's the town of Edfu, which is in the south of Egypt, and this is a place where there was the god that is focused there is Horus. There's a lot of mythology around the god Horus because he's incredibly important in the Egyptian pantheon. Every king was seen as an incarnation of the god Horus. So in this location, you have him, and I can talk about his mythology in general, but also the specific mythology associated with the area of Edfu, because that was his major area of worship. But also, there is this fabulously, amazingly well-preserved temple dedicated to him, which is a major tourist attraction, really. People travel there to see this temple. And so it already kind of creates a structure for me. If so, I think, okay, well, I can begin that chapter talking about myself visiting this location, and so I've been there. I can picture it. I can describe it. Then I can talk a bit more generally about, who is Horus. It's important to set a bit of background, and then I can go a bit more specific and talk about a bit more about, so if you are visiting Edfu, then, what are the more specific mythology and legends connected with this temple? So I tried to follow that same sort of pattern, I think, in the different chapters. And this is just following the Egyptians themselves, and the way that their religion was differing across the country depending on the gods of the different towns and cities. So it made it easier, I guess, just to follow the lead, really, I suppose.
That's awesome. I think the biggest thing when I was reading it that struck me, probably two things. Number one is the amount of variation in myths throughout, like you would mention in multiple different chapters, the same myth, but then there'd be variations depending from the different areas. And also that gods change.
Mm,
Do you want to just
that's
chat a little
true.
bit about those two things as a whole? Because
Yeah.
both of those blew my mind.
Yeah, the Egyptian gods do change depending on the location you're in. So you might have a myth in one part of the country that has a certain god in the kind of lead role, and then you might have a god in a different part of the same myth in a different part of the country with a different god doing that role. There was no real kind of set, perfect story. There's no set myth. These things changed were according to location, according to time. They switched around the gods that were involved in these stories. And so that leads to all these variations. And of course, we're dealing with often fragmentary material that's spread over thousands of years. And so obviously there's going to be changes because of this too, that simply that these myths will evolve as the stories get told by different people at different times. And even some quite fundamental parts of Egyptian mythology have variations too, depending on the location. And that was one of the fun things about that this book gave me the chance to write about a bit. That some of these things that you might normally maybe, I guess, skip over in a general book that's covering it in a thematic way, the locations almost force you to talk about some of these variations because they are what's maybe one of the major myths of that location. I think a good example of that is it's quite well known, I think, that the Egyptians had obviously strong beliefs surrounding the sun god and his power. He was a creator, one of the most important gods, and very visible, obviously, in a place like Egypt, where the sun is always present. And so the traditional myth, to put it very straightforwardly, is they believed that the sun god was reborn in the morning. He would rise over the eastern mountains and kind of cross the sky in a boat, sailing, because the blue sky, was regarded as water. So the gods sail on boats. He would sail across the sky and then set as an old man on the west, behind the western mountains. And he aged over the course of the day, then entered an underworld, which the Egyptians called the Duat, and he passed through this realm, got regenerated, and was reborn. And this is an endless kind of mythological cycle that we could all witness ourselves every day. Now, there are variations even in the details of this story, even sometimes in the same tomb. Lots of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings have these underworld books that talk about the sun god's journey through the night and what he gets up to. And even these have different variations within them, within the same tomb. But what was really fascinating when researching and writing this and looking into these variations was that, okay, you go to a place like the Fayum Oasis. I have a chapter on the Fayum Oasis. And this myth there is very adapted to the local environment. The same sort of idea, but with much more local way of looking at it. Um, and so if in the Fayoum you had the problem that, okay, you're already actually beyond these western mountains. So you can't really just say this rising over there and setting over there because I'm already over here on the western side. It doesn't make any sense. Um, and so they had to think about this. And the Egyptians in the rituals and in the mythology generally, I think, are quite practical. They like solving problems that arise and come up with sensible solutions within their mythological structure. Um, and so what they did there is the Fayum oasis is dominated by Lake Karun, which is this huge lake that dominates the oasis. Um, and so they adapted the mythology there and said, okay, well, the sun god here rises on the eastern side from that lake, rises into the sky, crosses the sky, then sets on the western side in the lake, goes into the lake, transforms into a crocodile, and then over the course of the night, the sun god then regenerates as he travels up at the bottom of the lake as a crocodile, and then is reborn the next morning on the other side and begins the journey again. So it's the same idea, but with a different focus that's been affected by the geography in that area. And so it's these kind of variations that I think are quite interesting about Egyptian mythology and quite fun to write about. Um, and so you'll see this in different parts of the book where, sometimes I'll focus on these things and sometimes I'll tell the more, I guess, the best preserved version of a myth or the longest version of a myth. And then I'll talk about some of these local variations too. So it was a good opportunity to write about some of these aspects of the gods and goddesses.
So would you say the versions of the myths that are more popular or more well-known are either the ones that have been preserved best or the ones that are the longest? Maybe not necessarily were the ones that were believed by the most people, but were just the ones that so happened to survive?
You mean today, like the ones that
Yeah.
people know today? That
Yeah.
yeah. I think it's all a case of what has survived. Yeah, and sometimes that's in the case of classical writers. And so many of the myths that are popular today are ones that were preserved by the Greeks and Romans later on, that, like particularly the story of Osiris. Now, on top of that, then we look at the ancient material, and we, we're left with what survives, what is found during excavations. And even that is very fragmentary, and you've got to piece these things together. And of course, because much of our evidence comes from desert sites like temples and tombs, particularly tombs, there's this kind of very much a focus on afterlife beliefs. And so you'll find a lot more about Osiris, for example, because he's a god of the blessed dead and regeneration. He'll be mentioned in every tomb. And so I think the story of Osiris, which was very important, of course, for afterlife beliefs and things like this, there's a lot of information about someone like him compared to maybe some of the other gods, which might have been popular on a state level, at least. I mean, also there's the difference between what might have been going on in the major temples and what's been going on at the village level in a person's household, where you're worshipping more local gods too. And I'm sure there would have been lots more stories about local gods in the village level that just were never written down. And so we've got a kind of we have a great insight into the religion, but it's often very much focused on the kind of state, high-level religion, the kind of what's going on in the major temples, and even then, the major temples that have survived well. In which case, sometimes that's very late in Egyptian history, which again puts a focus on a particular period and not the earlier periods. So there's all sorts of problems, and you've got to kind of adapt and point these things out too. I try to be clear in in my books where there's problems with the evidence, or where there's where a story ends. Let's say the papyrus breaks, we don't know what happens next. So that's all we got.
I remember quite a few times where you say, this is fragmentary, or we don't have this bit, but then this happens, so we have to assume that this is what happened in the bit that we don't have, which I thought was great, because sometimes you read a book and you're like, well, why don't why don't we know this? Where is the rest of it? Or did you just make that section up? You've got to. So I found it really great that you would say, this is fragmentary, or multiple times I know that you sort of had to take things from multiple different sources, I guess, like different things that were left behind to try and reconstruct this story, which must have been such a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's lucky that this has been a major focus of many Egyptologists since the decipherment of hieroglyphics. I mean, many people have been collecting this information, and as I say, a lot of this material comes from temples and tombs, which have been studied for a very long time. So I at least have the benefit that lots of this stuff has already been studied, and I know where to look for the information. But yeah, it takes a very, very long time to kind of look through all of this, look for the variations, and then to keep going back. I found that was there's so much detail, so much variation, so much out there, in fact, that I found at the very beginning of writing this book that even though I'd already previously written a book on Egyptian mythology, I still had to kind of almost begin again because it's so complex in places, and to try and get there in my head and write a lot of very clear notes, and then even with the clearest possible notes, having to keep revisiting the texts again and again just to make sure that everything is perfect. Really, everything is being explained clearly. Because part of my aim with doing this is to write something that anybody can pick up and read. This isn't a book that I've written for specialists. I've written this for anybody with an interest. And that's why I was very much interested in making sure that there's no real complex terminology, there's no very much academic phrasing. I wanted it to be a fun read, whilst also being academically rigorous in the sense that, I want the details in there to be absolutely correct. And so pulling this all together took a very long time. In fact, it took me years to write and pull this together, to put this book together. And so, yeah, it's really exciting to see it out now and finished and kind of standing behind me, because I have so many years of just kind of thinking, where should I put this? Is this the best place to put this myth? Again, because of the variation thing, sometimes you're like, okay, so this version of the myth stars Thoth. So should I put there in the chapter where I focus on Thoth, or should I look at one of the other characters in that myth and put it in a different place? And yeah, it was interesting trying to pull it together and make it narratively flow. I wanted someone to enjoy reading the chapters and not just feel like something was thrown in there and it would become sort of, there was a danger that I would write a myth or two and then there'd be a sort of information dump, like exposition in a movie.
Yeah.
Where it suddenly just switches gears and becomes, and this is everything we know about afterlife beliefs or something. I didn't want that to happen. I wanted it to feel natural. So yeah, I put a lot of thought into how to present the information to make it as accessible as possible to anybody.
I thought you could tell that it was really well researched. You could see just with the amount of information, but it was incredibly easy to read. I don't read a whole lot of nonfiction from start to finish. I'm definitely read a section for whatever I'm researching at that time and then put it back on the shelf until I need another section of it. So reading it from start to finish was something that I really enjoyed. I thought, and you can really feel your voice coming through. There was quite a few times where I've annotated and I'm like, that's funny, or like, oh my god, I was thinking that too, because you've put in these little commentaries and it's exactly what I was thinking so many of the times, which I think also gave it a really light-hearted feel, but then that you're still reading fact and information and that you're getting it. So yeah, I thought that it was really easy to read.
Well, I'm glad you think that, because I tried to mix a bit of humor in with the whenever I try to write something like this. I think it's important. You want people learn better when they're having a good time, when they're enjoying themselves, and so I think to write a book like this, you want the reader to have a good time when reading it. Obviously, I'm writing it for people to sit and enjoy reading in an evening, or maybe if they're on a cruise or something, and they're thinking, oh well, where am I going tomorrow? I can look at that's in the book. I can read about that place. I don't want them to fall asleep when reading it, but at the same time, I think when you put in a few jokes, it helps people remember certain key details too. I try to think of a good example where I do that, but I mean, there's a bit in the beginning in chapter 2 where I talk about Horus, and I make a point of kind of joking that there are lots of different types of Horus. There's many manifestations. You'll find this type of Horus, and this type of Horus, and this type of Horus, and actually there's still more to come. And so I think by making it a bit lighter that way, people will remember that later on instead of getting annoyed when they say, "Who's this Horus?" This is another type of Horus. They'll go, "Oh, actually, yeah, that bit made me smile at the beginning," and so I remember that there were various Horuses, and that this shouldn't put me off. Um, and so, yeah, no, I think having a good voice and trying to put across a bit of personality in these things helps a lot, because you think of lectures and things. When you give a lecture in person, it's you want to put across a bit of personality, and people want to hear that. And I don't see why you can't do that in books that are, still academically rigorous too. It doesn't always have to be in the sort of passive voice kind of academic style for these things. And being a travel book too, you want to feel like someone's speaking to you. I wanted to feel like someone who was telling the stories to you, like addressing you, the reader.
It felt as if you were the travel guide, and like
Yeah,
we're walking along the side, and you were saying this stuff to me, looking at the things, and it felt as if you were right there, which I thought was made it really enjoyable to read compared to other non-fiction books, which can be very much here are the facts, and let's continue just talking about the facts. So
yeah.
it made it a really easy read. Did you have a favorite site that you wrote about, either visiting or writing or researching?
I think there's lots of great places, obviously, but my favorite, I think, is always been, even when sort of researching and writing this, but also even before I started this book, my favorite site generally is Saqqara, which is covered in this book in the sort of Memphis and its necropolis section, which is a chapter, sorry. And so in that chapter, I talk about Memphis, which was close to modern Cairo, and the necropolis of that city, which is famous places like Giza, where the most famous pyramids are. But just south of Giza, you have Saqqara, which is another great necropolis where people were buried for thousands of years. And so I really, really enjoy that site, visiting that place and writing about it, because there's so much going on there. It's not one of these sites where it was used for a short period. You've got thousands of years of burials, of different types of burials, not just human burials, but also animals as well. So there were shafts filled with mummified animals in this location. But it's also the place where you get the step pyramid of King Djoser, which is the first pyramid in history. It's the first monumental stone building, and that's really impressive. Every time I see that, I think, wow, this is an amazing place. The setting is amazing, the kind of where you are, the feeling of being there. But um, you'll visit somewhere like the Step Pyramid, and you'll see that it's not just a pyramid on its own. It's not just standing there in the desert. There's all this other stuff going on around it, but also there's a complex around it too. Like there's like a wall around it and various buildings associated with the pyramid, and these all have different meanings. There's an entire kind of subterranean section to it as well, with little tunnels leading to the king's burial. And all of these have these kind of, it's really impressive to see these things. And so I think, and when you think of its age as well, this is like going back thousands of years, 2600, 2700 BC-ish, and the kind of thinking that went into the design and the religious elements of it. The fact that much of the architecture within the complex surrounding that step pyramid replicates things that you would have seen in kind of reed and matting made of perishable materials, and they've made them, and so they now look, so they're made of stone. They copied that style, but in stone now. And so it's almost like they've kind of mummified the entire complex, not just the king himself. These things that would have degraded, they've carved out of stone instead. And so it lasts forever, and it's still there today, so it clearly worked. And then nearby at Saqqara, you have later pyramids as well, where you've got the pyramid texts, which are these really early descriptions of the king's journey to the afterlife. And so there's so much you could see at this one site. I could have written hundreds of pages just about that. And of course, I had to pull myself back because they can't just write about Saqqara. But yeah, I really enjoy going there. I really enjoy seeing it and just kind of looking around and feeling just awed and impressed by everything that still survives there.
Amazing. And it's so interesting that some of the sites, I can't think of which one it is, that was so important in ancient Egypt, and there's nothing left now except for one thing. I can't think of what site it is.
Oh.
It was at the end, close
I
to the
think
end of the book.
Yeah, I think you're thinking of Pi-Ramesses, which is the great city that King Ramesses II, this very famous pharaoh, of course, Ramesses the Great, had built. And now you go there, and it's a small village called Cantia, and there's nothing to see. It's just a pair of stone feet in a field. That's just the remains of a statue. Um, and so, yeah, this isn't a tourist site. I wanted to talk about Pi-Ramesses and the legends of kings and the legends of Seth, because Seth had temples there. But it's not it's not a site that tourists go to. Unlike many other chapters, which are very much focused on places you might visit, like Luxor, the Theban East Bank, the West Bank, Aswan, the Saqqara, Giza, and stuff. But as part of the Memphite necropolis. But then there's like this chapter here. It's like, and so you shouldn't really go there. You won't see anything. You'll just disturb a guy's field because there's a pair of feet there. There's nothing to see. But the interesting thing there is that the city basically fell into disuse when the canals around it kind of got silted up. And so the story there is they dragged all the major stonework to another site nearby, which is called Tanis. And so one of the reasons there's nothing left is because they moved the city pretty much and reused it. It's kind of ancient recycling. And I mean, so underneath the ground, there are archaeologists working there. They've been working there for a long time now. And yeah, underneath the ground, there's the remains of like the city, the kind of foundations and other things like this, which you can see when they do kind of these scans of the ground and things, and when they start excavating. But to actually see the kind of remains, to get a feel as a tourist, to see these remains, you have to go to Tanis, which is this nearby city where later pharaohs reused the stonework. And so you'll see on one side of some of these stones, like, an inscription from one period, and then on the back, an inscription from another period, because they've reused it. And many of these monuments there come from the time of Ramesses II, even though the city is later than him. And so it's really fascinating, this kind of use of ancient material too. The pharaohs were constantly reusing these materials, stonework like this. And Pi-Ramesses is a good example of that. But yeah, it's kind of, it's unusual being there. And kind of just seeing this is where this grand ancient city used to be, and now it's just a very normal, very nice little village, and a village town, kind of like many other places in the Delta. And you think, okay, so this is where Ramses' palace used to be probably, and this is where Grand Temples used to be, and okay, right, there's a field, okay, but it's still So it's. I'm glad I wanted to include that because I think Pi-Ramesses is this major city of the ancient world, but it also emphasizes too just how some things have been preserved, like these grand temples, and some places, especially cities and settlements, just don't really last because they're often built in places where people live today.
Yeah.
So over thousands of years, these things have just gone, and you can't really find anything without excavating or doing sort of ground penetrating radar. So Egypt has still a lot more to discover out there and a lot more to find in places like this, because it's not always just the obvious things like tombs that have been found or these major temples that everybody knows about. There's plenty more out there, and particularly in the Delta.
Yeah, the idea of a site being disused in antiquity makes me think of one of my favorite periods of ancient Egypt, which was when Akhenaten built his own site, and then when he died, they were like, "Nah, don't want to use this site anymore." And his whole radicalization of obviously we have evidence that all the other gods were still venerated, but he sort of brought the Aten to the very head of the pantheon, which I guess beforehand, although there was Osiris and Horus who were quite high up, it was more even, I guess.
Well, I guess the thing with Akhenaten is it's hard to kind of figure out sometimes what he was thinking, and people do kind of sort of create their own theories around him. And yes, so beforehand, the Aten existed, but he wasn't very prominent. No one, it was just a manifestation of the sun god. So for those people who are listening, the Aten is basically just it's the physical sun disk, the circle you see in the sky. And this is a manifestation of the sun god. And he'd been around for a long time, but he was just one you didn't really find mentioned very often. Yeah, compared to gods like Horus and Osiris, particularly Amun-Ra, which was one of these very, very important gods in the time of Akhenaten. The temple of Amun at Karnak was the most important temple in the country. And so that was the situation going into Akhenaten's reign. I mean, even Akhenaten, the king you're talking about, who developed the cult of the Aten, he was born as Amenhotep. He's Amenhotep the Fourth at the beginning of his reign, so his name makes reference to Amun, this important god of his time. But things very quickly change, so it looks like it should be a normal reign. You've got Amenhotep the Fourth coming along. Amun is an important state god. Okay, he goes to Karnak to start building, and Karnak is where the major temple to Amun is. This is in modern Luxor, Thebes. But what does he do there? He starts building a temple to the Aten instead. And so it kind of begins this kind of strange kind of shift in Egyptian art, architecture, religion. And he quickly changes his name to Akhenaten instead, making reference to the Aten, removes Amun from his name. And so this is when you start getting this kind of shift. And he seems to have a particular hatred of the god Amun. Amun's name starts being scratched off everywhere, as well as other members of the kind of family grouping of Amun and other gods too. And plural references to gods also gets attacked and they become singular. And so it's this kind of very unusual, very quite short phase in Egyptian history. I mean, Akhenaten only reigned for 17 years or so, but he does all of this changes quite rapidly. So suddenly, and it depends on how you look at it, but he's certainly attacking Amun and some of the other gods too, removing their importance. I guess that makes sense to me because he's a god who becomes he's a king who becomes obsessed with worshipping a god of light, the sun disk. Amun is a god that represents the hidden, and is worshipped in darkness, in a little sanctuary at the back of the temple, like many Egyptian gods. And so, if this is a god of hiddenness, he's pretty much almost the opposite of what you would find of a sun god. So it kind of makes sense that he would be attacking that god because there are others he kind of left alone, like Thoth, for example. He wasn't attacked consistently, like Amun's name is. But I mean, even stranger then. Actually, no, not so strange. Other people did this, but he creates this city, the one you were making reference to, Tell-el-Amarna. And it's a short-lived city that basically was made from scratch in a place where people hadn't really built before. It was a kind of new city dedicated to the Aten. And they built it very quickly, full of palaces, multiple palaces, in fact, a grand temple, a smaller temple to the Aten. They started cutting tombs, including a royal tomb in the cliffs on the eastern side, which is the opposite of where they would normally build tombs. You normally build tombs in the west because that was the direction of death. He built the tombs on the east side in the direction of the sunrise. And started making different styles of art, started composing. As far as we can see, it might have come directly from the king, these hymns to the Aten. But as you already mentioned too, that it seems that from the normal people's point of view, they were still allowed to kind of continue with the kind of household religions. It doesn't seem like this complete ban on the traditions. It just seems that on a state level, there were certain gods he kind of wanted to get rid of, or at least I don't think it's more a case of destruction. It's more a case of, I guess, almost like ignoring them. We're just not going to deal with that guy anymore. He's not relevant
Just
to us.
pretend that he's not there
We're going to
anymore.
focus on yeah. We'll just pretend he's not there. We're not going to speak to Amun. We're going to just talk about the Aten instead. And so it's a very strange, quite short period. But the site of Amarna, the site of which in the ancient times was Akhenaten, um, it was never really used again so much after the time when Akhenaten died, because after Akhenaten died, everybody just went, no, we're going to go back to the old ways. And so this phase ended quite quickly, and they never really used the city again. And eventually, everything just gets covered in sand. But the foundations are left of this entire city under the sands there. And so it's one of the world's most important archaeological sites, and it's really important because it shows a snapshot of this time in Egyptian history, um, and this kind of and it gives you insights into trying to these changes that were going on and how life was in this city under this quite unusual king. And he's an intriguing character generally. I mean, people are always writing about Akhenaten and trying to figure out what was going through his mind. And you get some people who describe him as a sort of crazy despot, and people who see him more as a sort of pacifist or deep religious thinker. And there's all these different Akhenatens that exist depending on which book you read. Um, I mean, he certainly wasn't a pacifist, for example. This was an early, I think, idea about him, but as we've learnt more about him, we know that there were military missions sent out under him, so that's certainly not the case. And so it seems to really intrigue a lot of people, this idea of this kind of, I mean, they call him the heretic king and all these things like this, a king who went against the norms. But I tried to explore a bit about this in that chapter about Tell-el-Amarna, to try and create a balance, I suppose. I talk as much about what remained the same as what changed under him, to try and, I guess, present some of this different information that so that people can kind of judge for themselves how revolutionary he was. So yeah, hopefully people will enjoy reading that section too.
So for anyone who is interested in Garry's book, you will be able to find it. I will leave the link for it down below, as well as a book review that you can find on our website and any other social media links. You'll be able to find them all down there. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me here.
This video was brought to you by World History Encyclopedia. For great articles and interactive content, head to our website via the link below. If you like my shirt, you can find this design and a bunch more on our shop at worldhistory.store, or you can find a link for it under the merch tab in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon with another video.